Hi, welcome to week 3 of Exploring English Education. This is video 2 in the series that you are looking at this week on our topic English and Identity from School to Cinema. So the first video looked more at ideas surrounding identity and ways in which we can discuss it a bit more systematically and think about this potentially quite woolly concept in more rigorous and systematic terms. This video is going to build on some of those ideas and thinking in particular about fictional representations of teachers, students and education institutions, including schools and universities. So schools and university spaces form the backdrop for many works of fiction, from television shows, things like Teachers, Bad Education, Fresh Meat, Waterloo Road, Byker Grove and so on, many plays including things like The History Boys, many films, including things like Dead Poets Society and Stand and Deliver. We're going to talk a bit more in detail about those in a moment. And also novels, lots and lots of novels, a particular series of novels, things like Harry Potter, Malory Towers, Jane Eyre, Lucky Jim, all have as a backdrop for them with varying degrees of engagement about thinking about education itself and teaching and being a student, the act of learning, as varying degrees of focus within those different stories on them. And we're going to think specifically today about works of fiction, whether that's films, books or television shows, where education isn't just an incidental element but a fundamental theme. It's something that the text or the show or the film actually sort of actively explores. And if this is something that you would like to think about for your first assignment, to do a close reading of a film or a television show that focuses on education, that's absolutely legitimate, and I've seen some great pieces of work from students in the past that do just that. If that's something that you are interested in, I would recommend introducing this latter criteria of thinking about picking something where education isn't just the backdrop, but is also a theme that is explored, that has something of a degree of focus within that work of fiction. So today we're going to look at films that don't just include but actively explore education and schooling. And there are really two questions that I want you to reflect on and consider, both as I talk you through the material that I'm going to look at here, but also thinking about other works of fiction that discuss or focus on education and schooling, whether that's at school or university. These two questions: how are teachers and students represented in these films? And the second thing is thinking about, as those representations are something where, for in particular people who have not been in school for some time, perhaps did or didn't go to university, as a space, a source where people are getting their ideas about what teachers are, what students do, what students are like, what education spaces like schools and universities are like. Are these representations inspiring? Are they dangerous? Or are they a bit of both? Those are the two questions that I'm going to encourage you to reflect on today. So we get lots and lots of examples of great teachers in fiction. They're very often inspirational figures, and there are lots and lots of works of fiction. We're going to focus specifically on films today, where a teacher is constructed as a protagonist who is inspirational. They are great, they are fantastic. It's very often a genre that teachers will talk about as something when they're going back from half term or starting a new term that they like to watch. It's kind of G's them up, it makes them really excited to go back. People will also often describe films like these as a key reason why they decided that they wanted to be a teacher in the first place. And it's interesting for us to start unpicking a little bit. In what ways are these teachers constructed as being great teachers? And I would suggest to you that there are two things that are very often focused on. First of all, deep knowledge of and passion for the subject, and often, though not always, an ability to inspire this same kind of deep knowledge or passion for the subject in their students, sometimes where other teachers or the educational institution has been unsuccessful. So they're very much constructed as a brilliant individual. The second thing that is often focused on, sometimes in the alternative, sometimes as well as to why this teacher is great, is an ability to build and maintain strong relationships with their students. So there's really two aspects of being a great teacher that are often represented that we could think about here. One of them is more sort of aligned with the academic iteration of that job and that profession. And the other is sort of more pastoral, something about relationships with students, often representations, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, of rescuing students from their own circumstances, or bringing them up out of a difficult set of circumstances, often where parents or caregivers have been unable to do so. In both cases, this particular teacher is often constructed as somebody who will succeed where their colleagues have been unsuccessful. They're also very often rule breaker kind of figures, and this is really interesting to think about in terms of the relationship that that great teacher is presented as having with the educational institution in which they work. So it's quite rare that you get examples in fiction of great teachers who follow all of the rules, that work with the school or the university and are successful in that way. It's often a narrative of going against the institution, of often sometimes putting their own job or even their livelihood, their health at risk in order to achieve these things where other people have been unsuccessful. So in other words, great or inspirational teaching in fiction is almost always presented in fiction as an individual rather than a team endeavour. And it's interesting to think about how that contrasts with the realities in many schools and universities up and down the country, where it is much more normal that the teacher, the team of teachers, and the school or the educational institution all work together to try and build success and give the best opportunities for those students. So that's just an initial thing that we could think about as a potential point of contrast. So when I'm talking about these kind of films, what sort of films do I mean? Well, it's very interesting that they span across all sorts of genres. So we see this inspirational teacher figure represented in things like comedies, things like School of Rock, dramas, very sort of heavy drama sometimes. This is a film from the 90s called Dangerous Minds. There's some very interesting research around this film, which is loosely based on a true story of an ex-Marine who went into a very challenging school in a place in America. And this film is very interesting because it has been critiqued quite heavily for having a sort of white saviour narrative, in particular because in the actual set of circumstances in the real school, many of the students that Michelle Pfeiffer's character who represents here, many of her students were white, but in the film there were almost no white students. They have all been diversified as to students from various ethnic backgrounds, whilst other teachers in the school are represented as being from different ethnic backgrounds. So there was a lot of heavy critique around this film. There's interesting research if you're interested in this, that suggests that actually by doing that decision that was made in the production of the film, that it really turned it from something that was a really positive narrative into something that was quite problematic, because the suggestion was none of these other teachers have been successful with all of these students from diverse range of backgrounds, and it's the white teacher that comes in to save them and is the one who is successful. So really interesting sort of politics to think about in representations in fiction as well there. Things like Dead Poets Society, quite unusual in that it is a very male-oriented film where typically that is often not the case, and is also based in quite an elite school as well. Tends to be more the norm that these kinds of works of fiction focus on schools in very challenging areas or challenging contexts, and it's interesting to think about why that might be. Films like Precious, not one to watch if you've been having a bad day. It's quite a depressing film, but very good, very interesting. This one focused much more than the ones that we've looked at so far, I think, on the pastoral aspect of teaching and education, much more so than the actual academic sort of side of it, whereas I think Dead Poets Society, we could argue, has much more of that imbuing a passion for the subject kind of narrative within it. Things set in universities like Good Will Hunting and A Beautiful Mind, really interesting films that both deal with what you do when students or indeed teachers have complex mental health issues and the intersections between education and well-being in that particular dimension. Both two quite interesting. I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, representing the figure of the genius student and what a teacher is supposed to do with a genius student, or indeed, in the transitions, I won't spoil it if you've not seen it, but also a genius teacher. Also a very interesting figure that crops up repeatedly in fictional representations of education. Finding Forrester and Coach Carter, again, slightly lesser known ones, both interesting in that Neither Sean Connery nor Samuel L. Jackson's characters in this are technically teachers. Sean Connery is a writer and Samuel L. Jackson is a basketball coach, but taking on that role of engaging students in the academic side of their education, as well as building relationships and encouraging them to be successful within academic performance. So some interesting sort of parallels we could draw between those as well. And lastly, Stand and Deliver, which I would be quite surprised if any of you have come across. It's quite an old film, but very interesting one, looking at a maths teacher, very, very heavily focused on the idea of imbuing deep knowledge in sometimes what can superficially appear to be quite cruel ways. This is a representation of a teacher who is extremely strict about behaviour and attendance, and how he serves his students through those particular means. This is an interesting film that is often talked about by people who adhere to a more traditional model of education as being something of an anomaly in that it really focuses on and champions things like strict discipline as a means by which to support and help students rather than to punish them. And of course there are all sorts of fictional representations that we think about. Matilda is another fantastic one that appear in various works of literature that we could draw on as well. So I've suggested to you already that teachers are often presented as hero or almost sort of saviour figures in these kinds of films, and I want to take a moment to unpick that in a little bit more detail about the various ways in which teachers are constructed in this manner in fictional representations. And I want to encourage you all of the way through is to reflect on and potentially problematise some of these representations as to what this is telling us, is telling teachers, is telling students, and telling the general public about what great teaching looks like, and how teachers can take on this mantle of being a hero or a saviour to a class or a student. So very often they inspire a student or a class where all others have failed. So again, setting themselves against an educational institution rather than working with it. So in offering a positive framing of the teacher, often offering a quite negative view of schools and education, and sometimes other teachers. These teachers are presented as being the exception rather than the rule. Often an even more extreme iteration of this is you will find that these teacher protagonists will take an interest in a student or a class where others have ignored them or given up. This quite often goes along with representations of a student or a class who are presented as not being particularly academically able, or who have not attained very well in their schooling up to that point, and have been abandoned by the institution and by other people in the profession, and often as well by their parents and caregivers, who are presented often as having quite low aspirations for them, though that is not always the case. Sometimes you see teacher and parent or caregiver teaming up to fight these other aspects of formal education in order to try and gain success for that student. That they gain respect from a student or class where all others have failed, and very often things like behaviour and attendance come in to be key themes here. Again, sort of presenting it almost as though if a student or a class don't behave for a particular teacher or don't attend school, that somehow that is the school or those other teachers' fault, and that really what they needed to do was gain respect for the class, and once that's been achieved, then education can be successful. And it's interesting to think about the pros and cons of presenting that particular narrative. Dangerous Minds is a really good example of a film that has that particular narrative. Interestingly as well, taking this a step further, and this is prevalent theme through many, many films, in particular those that are set in a context where the students live in very challenging or difficult circumstances, is that you will often see a narrative where the teacher will actively intervene in a student's home life and rescue them sometimes from abusive partners, relationships, parents, caregivers, and so on. Again, makes for a really, really fantastic story, but interesting to think about the reality of how able teachers are to do that. There are certainly safeguarding issues that potentially arise in reality around those particular things, and also interesting to think about how this sometimes sets the idea of the teacher and school as being something which is set against home and that particular context that the student comes from, rather than being something that works together is something where home has failed and teacher must therefore go in to ensure success for that student. And I want to suggest to you that very often these films result in this sort of super teacher narrative. These teachers who will push a class to achieve academically in a manner that others have assumed impossible, or help students to discover a hidden passion or talent that has evaded the notice of their parents, of their caregivers, help students to discover and accept themselves, or make significant sacrifices for their students or their class, sometimes putting their own health and sometimes even their safety in jeopardy. Coach Carter are a really good example of this. So what I want to suggest to you and just encourage you to think about in the rest of this video is, I want to suggest that whilst these characters and their actions can make for really compelling, brilliant storytelling, it does also raise questions about how realistic or indeed healthy these visions of the super teacher are for teachers on the ground. It leads us to question, when we think about popular ideas about what makes a great teacher, do these super teacher narratives place unrealistic expectations for students, for parents, about what teachers should be doing or are able to achieve? Is this something which teachers are likely to internalise and think to themselves, if I'm not doing this, that I'm failing my students, that this is my fault, this needs to be my job? So it's useful to think about whether or not these particular representations are always helpful or harmful, or whether or not they're a combination of both. We could always say, of course, that these are fictional representations and everybody understands that, so it's not problematic. And equally, we could think about it in ways of questioning that and saying, oh, actually, perhaps there are things that we are, as a society, tacitly internalising about the role of teaching and what teaching is or should be, and what is reasonable to place on a teacher in terms of expectations, both from other people but also from themselves. So this may be the scenario that, in extreme senses, we could think about. Are the teachers who are sat there who think, oh, I've watched Coach Carter and none of my students have ever turned up on my door in the middle of the night. Nobody's ever shot at me because I've been protecting my students. And this might sound like I'm being flippant, but for teachers who are working in really, really challenging areas, in particular, there's a lot of research in the research pack on education equity that explores this. That sometimes that is not very far from reality. Students will be in gangs, they will be engaged in very criminal, sometimes, behaviours outside school. And it is interesting to think about how far teachers may internalise and take on board these ideas. The idea that if you don't allow a student into your home in the middle of the night, have you somehow failed? Is that not your job? Whilst at the same time, of course, we know that things like safeguarding prohibit those kinds of things and will inevitably set a teacher against an educational institution, be it a school or a university, if that's something that they feel compelled to do. So lots of tensions that we could explore here in these representations. And we are going to explore how this is a reality for some teachers later in the course. The last thing I really want to touch on is thinking about the relationships that are often presented in these films between teachers on the one hand and a parent or carer on the other. The teacher as hero narrative often, as I've said, is set against a backdrop of challenging circumstances for the class or student. And this isn't always because students are living in poverty or have family members or come from a neighbourhood that is involved with crime. Dead Poets Society is a really good example of actually a very privileged student, superficially, who has a really problematic relationship with their parents, that the teacher comes in and acts as a sort of hero figure. So part of the challenge of this is that often the figure of the absent or the unsupportive carer or parent comes hand in hand with this idea of teacher as hero. And that means that teachers are often depicted as knowing their students better than parents or carers, being chosen as an advisor or a confidant by that student or by that class in lieu of choosing their parent or carer, supporting students when they're being abused or have been rejected, having more belief in students when they are abused or rejected by that person, believing in them, believing in their capabilities in a way that parents and carers are often not represented as sharing, or having greater ambitions for them, or having their good intent thwarted by a parent or carer. And again, Dangerous Minds and Precious are both examples of films where this is very heavily kind of focused on as a theme. So I just want to really leave you then with thinking about how potentially problematic that could be if these fictional representations are not treated purely as fiction, and thinking about reflecting on your own experiences of school and education, about which elements of your support network over your time of successfully coming to university, for example, that you needed in order for that to be something that was successful for you. And I would suggest that in many, many cases, it's much more in reality an instance of teacher and parent or carer working together rather than being set against one another. And it's interesting to think about that as a very distinct representation. The last trope that I want to touch on in this video is the idea of the genius student figure as a really interesting, quite common figure that arises in films that focus on exploring education. Because often, if it's not a brilliant teacher, it may well be a brilliant student, or sometimes a combination of both of them, that are presented as being a focal point as the protagonists in these kinds of narratives. And I want to suggest to you that very often, and I think things like Good Will Hunting, Matilda, A Beautiful Mind, Finding Forrester are all really good examples of this, where students are often presented, if they're these genius figures, as being gifted on arrival. They're incredibly intelligent because that's who they are, not because of the interventions of the school or the teacher, but things that the teacher is then faced with dealing with that perhaps have been underappreciated, or also very often you get narratives where the student is really brilliant but is not engaged with formal education. This too, I think, is really interesting in thinking about how often this presents a narrative where students arrive as geniuses and are gifted and highly educated in spite of or without any engagement with formal schooling, and the kinds of messages that that potentially sends about what school is for and how useful it is to the wider public. Students often manifest this kind of genius knowledge, and Good Will Hunting is a good example of this, Stand and Deliver is another one, through rote learned knowledge. So they will often reel lots of things off and demonstrate their genius in that particular way. Again, something that may well arise because that's an easy way to represent that a student is really, really intelligent, that character is a genius in a particular film. But again, also interesting to think about how that shapes our conception of what a genius or someone who is highly intelligent actually is. Very often in these particular types of narratives, the great teachers are presented as adopting the role of recognising rather than creating or nurturing that student's potential. And that too, I think, is a really interesting note for us to finish on. So I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of fictional representations of teachers, students and education. And I look forward to talking further with you about this as we move forwards. Thank you very much.